Good morning, distinguished guests, participants. I'm Wei Jian from the Center for Strategic Futures. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Foresight Conference 2015, organized by the Center for Strategic Futures, as well as the Complexity Workshop, organized by the Institute Para Limes from the Nanyang Technological University. Both the conference and workshop are key events comprising the Singapore Foresight Week. This is the third time that we are holding the Foresight Conference and Complexity Workshop in parallel. Over the next 2 days, there will be opportunities for participants of both programs to interact with one another over tea breaks and meals. To kick off the conference, let's invite Mr. Peter Ho, Senior Advisor of the Center for Strategic Futures, to address us. Mr. Ho, please.
Friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, first let me welcome all of you to this Foresight Conference and to the Complexity Workshop. And I particularly want to extend a warm welcome to our guests from overseas who have traveled all this way to be with us here in Singapore. Now, as I think Wei Qian explained, the Foresight Conference and the Complexity Workshop are all part of the Foresight Week. And the Foresight Week is a biennial platform which we started in 2011 for experts, academics, practitioners, policymakers to meet and share experiences and perspectives. The International Risk Assessment and Horizon Scanning Symposium, which just preceded our two events today, is also part of the Foresight Week. And we see these meetings as valuable opportunity for us to jointly discuss ways to navigate through emerging strategic issues that confront us and the complex world that we live in. In Singapore, we are a small, open city-state, and we are keenly aware that the world that we live in does not unfold in predictable ways or in a linear fashion. And while we are not able to predict how the future will play out, we have to be actively thinking and preparing for it all the time. And that is why, as part of our efforts to think more systematically about an uncertain and unpredictable future, we hold a Foresight Week in order to exchange views across a range of backgrounds and disciplines, challenge each other's assumptions, and generate insights that can help us gain a better view into this very complex world. And all this is with a view towards making better decisions. The Foresight Conference this year takes a thematic approach focusing on global cities in 2035. And let me explain why we have chosen this topic. All of you would be familiar with the global trend of urbanization. In 2012, we reached a point where more than half of humanity lived in cities. And according to the United Nations, 60% of the world's population will be living in cities by 2030. And besides the enormous challenges that growing urbanization poses on resource demands of food, water, energy, on public health, and on good governance, the growing economic might of cities is drawing more and more interest in them. And according to the McKinsey Global Institute, the top 600 cities alone, ranked by their expected contribution to global GDP by 2025, held a fifth of the world's population, but accounted for more than half of the global GDP in 2007. Looking out to 2025, these same 600 cities are expected to generate 60% of the global GDP by then. So it's against this backdrop that we focus on global cities, and Singapore is certainly a global city by almost any measure. Global cities can be characterized by their economic, social, and cultural links to the rest of the world, as well as the outsized ability to influence the flow of people, capital, resources, knowledge, and innovation. Now consider New York, which is ranked number 1 in the 2015 Global Financial Centers Index. New York is home to the world's 2 largest stock exchanges and to most of the world's top investment banks and hedge funds. The size of the economy in the New York metropolitan area is comparable to Canada's, and its economy is bigger than Australia's and South Korea's GDP. More Fortune 500 companies have headquarters there than in any other American city. London too comes to mind. A.T. Kearney ranks London highest among global cities along the dimension of cultural experience, which looks at the number of international travelers and number of performing arts venues and other factors in its 2014 Global Cities Index. London's connectivity to the world is underscored by its airport system being the world's busiest by passenger count. In Asia, China's cities have also been rising up the ranks as Beijing grows in political clout and Shanghai's economic growth accelerates. While scholars generally agree that these characteristics define global cities, there are differences in views on what is the key defining feature. Sociologist Saskia Sassen, whom I think a lot of us know, coined this term, places great emphasis on the economic development processes and required economic features such as worldwide networks and central command functions. Others, however, suggest that a global city has to be more than just economically active in the international market. Instead, they cite other factors like cultural appeal and diversity. And as we look towards the future, it is important to deepen our understanding of forces shaping the global cities and how they may change. If we imagine ourselves 20 years into the future, will global cities still feature as dynamic nodes of human activity, or will people organize themselves into alternative forms of human settlement and on a different scale? Or worse, will they continue to grow but be mired in dysfunction and unable to govern themselves? Hopefully, as we debate some of these questions in the next 2 days, we will also develop insights that can guide the choices and decisions that we make today. Now let me come to the complexity workshop with Jan Vasbinder's permission. In the word of Stephen Hawking, the well-known theoretical physicist, the 21st century will be the century of complexity. There's increasing recognition that our world is complex, that the systems we are all part of are complex systems. The wicked problems and challenges that we have to deal with are all manifestations of the very nature of that complexity. Examples of such wicked problems on a global scale are climate change and the interactions between governance at local, national, and international levels, with the Greek crisis as a prime and current example. Examples on an urban scale are public health and city planning. Understanding the organizing principles underlying these problems may be informed by the evolution of biological problems and other complex systems that are the focus of much study and research in the science of complexity. In essence, complexity science can help us by first looking at the problems we deal with as systems of interacting elements that form, change, and evolve over time. And this contrasts with looking at the world around us in a top-down reductionist manner that has been the dominant approach for the past 4 centuries. Next, understanding the unpredictability of complex systems as this relates to the non-linear relationships between cause and effect. Third, developing tools for modeling and simulating complex systems. And fourth, providing an interdisciplinary context to the development of such tools. At present, neither complexity nor the way to deal with it is well defined. Hence, the goal of the Complexity Workshop this year brings together a group of complexity experts and notable thinkers across a whole range of disciplines to develop ideas on how a complexity lens might be developed to help leaders and policymakers to see the complexity that they are dealing with. We run the Complexity Workshop and the Foresight Conference as parallel events with opportunities for exchange of ideas because we believe that complexity science and futures thinking complement each other. Just like how futures thinking can help us break away from thinking about how the future will play out in a linear fashion, complexity science helps us to break away from our more conventional, reductionist view of issues into a more holistic one. An understanding of complexity has the potential to help us reframe our understanding of global cities and inspire new ideas, paradigms, and practices to better define the strategic choices we face. assess their consequences, and develop appropriate strategies. To illustrate, the concept of economic complexity developed by Hausman and Hidalgo suggests that the most important predictor of growth is the diversity of products that an economy possesses. We should ask how this different view might, in contrast to traditional measures such as governance, competitiveness, and human capital, allow us to better understand the success factors behind global cities. Complex systems analysis can also help us better understand how cities behave. Louis Betancourt, a physicist from Santa Fe Institute, suggests that cities are social reactors that react to a set of universal features that are determined by population size. He suggests that the size of a city can be used to predict variables such as the average income of citizens, level of violent crimes, and urban socio-economic productivity. And with that, Betancourt concludes that the population size determines 85% of a city's character, with the remaining 15% determined by other factors, such as local history, geography, and culture. And if this holds true, should global cities manage their size at an optimal level for their inhabitants? What do they sacrifice for that? As these two examples suggest, complexity science has significant potential to guide public policy. Horace Mann, an early American educationist and radical thinker, once remarked, "Let us not be content to wait and see what will happen, but give us the determination to make the right things happen." While the future is one that we cannot predict, I believe that conversations that we will have in the next 2 days will give us a glimpse of what future cities of 2035 might look like and how we might better understand these changes through the complexity lens so that we would be better prepared for them and so that we can direct the changes in a way that opportunities are maximized and the risks are minimized. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ho. I'll now like to invite Mr. Jan Vasbinder, Director Paralimas, to open the Complexity Lens workshop with a few words. Mr. Jan, please.
Thank you and welcome everybody. I think I'm opening the workshop when I'm there, so this I'll just make some general remarks now. In 1975, Joël de Rosnay wrote the book The Macroscope. The main theme of that book is that complex systems which govern our lives should be looked at as a whole rather than be taken apart in their constituents. De Rosnay sees the macroscope as the instrument that fills the gap between the microscope and the telescope. In his view, the microscope is the instrument to look at the infinite small, the telescope is the instrument to look at the infinite big, and the macroscope is the instrument to look at the infinite complex. Like in the microscope and the telescope, the lens is the key component in the macroscope. Such a lens, the complexity lens, does not exist yet. The workshop that we are about to start is meant to find out if we can establish a way to craft such a lens. For that, we need to know what such a lens should show us. So let me talk a bit about complexity, and it will in many sense, it will sort of duplicate what Peter said. But let me talk about complexity and complexity science before we start to discuss what such a lens should enable us to see and why we need to see that. There's nothing new to complexity. It has been around since the evolution of our universe started. It's only remarkable that we have started talking about it about 40 years ago, which is quite a small period of time, given the fact that the Big Bang took place 14 billion years ago. But until about 40 years ago, we have been looking at our world as if it was simple, as if if we only had to find the underlying simplicity to understand and manage it. We have done that by assuming a linear relationship between cause and effect. And if the problem was unsolvable with the tools and methods we had at our disposal, we decomposed it in smaller problems that we could solve. And we trusted that if we solve all the small problems, we could solve the bigger problems by linearly combining all the solutions to the partial problems. But more and more we find that the solutions we construct by combining the partial solutions do not match the problems we try to solve in the first place. And the reason is, of course, that we were ignoring the complexity of the problems that we wanted to solve. The science with which we try to understand our world has, in the last 400 plus years, essentially been reductionist science. It is based on the promise that we can learn the workings of a complex system by taking it apart and examine its components in isolation. We cannot. Because if taken apart, complex systems lose precisely the character that makes them complex. In short, reductionist science cannot solve complex problems facing mankind. But what about complexity science? Complexity science is different from other sciences because it deals with the real world, not with the laboratory world of the traditional hard sciences. In the laboratory, we can study things in isolation, disconnected from the real world by language and simplicity. In complexity science, our laboratory is the real world, with people who are connected, speak real languages, and have histories. That real world has real problems, like the economy, the climate, the differences between rich and poor, the nature and speed of urbanization, the changing balance between old and young in our demographic buildup, the loss of diversity in our ecology, and the impact of our technologies. The real world that is studied by complexity science has to deal with the fact that interactions between different participants do not occur along the linear path, that small changes can have enormous effects, that history plays a role, and that seemingly isolate systems are connected in mysterious and hidden ways. But complexity science itself is struggling to find methods to analyze and understand the ways in which complexity manifests itself, like emergence and self-organization. We still miss the capability or the tools to take what Murray Gell-Mann calls a crude look at the whole. What a complexity lens might do, or might be able to do in the future, is to take such a crude look at the whole. By looking through the lens, we can start to see the connections between the parts of the system and study the interactions that take place along those connections. The lens can then be a tool used by leaders in the industry and policy and academia to study the behavior of the systems they are dealing with and to develop strategies to deal with these systems. By crafting such a lens, such a complexity lens, crafting such a complexity lens will not provide answers to the complex systems of our world, but it will provide the tools by which others can look for answers. In fact, we may develop special lenses that can be used for different fields of analysis, like governance or urban planning. We need to know those problems in order to craft the lens through which we can analyze these problems. As I said in the beginning, there is no complexity lens yet. The workshop we are about to start is meant as a first step in the process to craft such a lens. At this stage, we already have some tools that may help craft the lens, like system science, simulation tools, modeling tools like agent-based modeling, network analysis, and others. Part of the challenge will be to combine those tools and to identify tools that we miss, and to do so without losing sight of the problems we want to focus on. And one such problem is how to approach the global cities of 2035. So I think the combination of the Foresight Conference that focuses on those global cities and the workshop that focuses on complexity lens is very fortunate and opportune one. So I wish you a very good 2 days.
Thank you, Mr. Vasbinder. For our opening keynote this morning, we are very honored to have Professor Sander van der Leeuw share with us a co-evolutionary perspective on urban dynamics, with an aim of bringing together both themes on cities and complexity, sparking conversations at the conference and workshop. A distinguished sustainability scientist, Prof. Sander is the Emeritus Dean of the School of Sustainability at the Arizona State University. He is also their foundation professor in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change. Let's welcome him on stage to deliver the opening keynote. Prof. Sander, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, welcome, good morning. And I would first like to express my thanks for all of you who brought me over here. Every time I come here, it's now been 4 or 5 times, I find a very vibrant intellectual community of great interest. And that, again, the last 2 days has been the case. And I hope that I can carry the light to the next couple of days and that you may all enjoy it. Let me start out, if I can figure this one. Yes? This is the crucial question. Many people looking at a modern city think of something organized. But as an archaeologist, which I originally am, I look back a long time. And 10,000 years isn't that much for me, you know? And from that perspective, you begin to realize that most cities, until very, very recently, were actually really unpleasant to live in. So the question is, why did people do that anyway? And that is what I'd like to talk about today. This is a little bit sort of how I feel. Because right now, as an archaeologist, having looked at long-term past times, I have to start looking at the future. And I want to sort of explain a few elements of all of that. And the way I do it in my classes in the university, where I have 20-year-olds, is basically say, you all think back to the time you first fell in love. And it was total chaos in your mind. You had no idea where it was going to go. It was looking at a future that was completely unknown. 5 years later, after the affair either became something serious or didn't, you actually start pointing lines. You start pointing causalities in what happened. And I think that is part of the schizophrenia that I live. First of all, I think to understand the past, archaeologists for a very long time have used an ex post perspective. They've looked at the origins of the present. As part of regular science, a science in which, because we have to prove everything we say, we can effectively only relate the past to the present and the present to the past, because for the past is the only place where we can ever prove anything in that relationship. That, I think, is one of the reasons why science has become so reductionist, and why, therefore, many phenomena of great complexity, like falling in love, have actually been simplified in science. If we want to look towards the future, we have to have an ex-ante perspective. We have to position ourselves as archaeologists, let's say 5,000 years ago, and then, looking from there, look to the present and see what might have emerged and how it might have emerged. That, of course, focuses on the emergence of novelty. But more than that, rather than reduce dimensions, it actually is focusing on the emergence of new dimensions. And that, I think, is a really important part. Now, the last phrase here, the more we think we know, the less we know, bears a little bit of explanation. Our minds can deal with a limited number of variables simultaneously. There are people who work on this. Some say it's 7 or 6 or 8 or 9, but it's limited. That's the important part. That means that when we initiate an action in relation to our environment, we actually do it on the basis of a perception of a tiny number of its dimensions. We oversimplify. Then we go into action, and our actions affect many, many more dimensions, And so, ultimately, what we create is a situation where we learn, and we learn more and more, but because we change things also, actually there is a disconnect, a growing disconnect, between what we know and the consequences of our own interventions. And I will get back to that in a moment. Complexity science. I've here highlighted a few things, some of them the same as Jan and Professor Ho mentioned, some of them different ones. I think a couple of really important ones is on the one hand that we need to think in complex systems more in relationships, in networks. Our Western world, and since I lived the last 10 years in America, I noticed this even more strongly than in other places, are based on thinking in entities, thinking in units, and not so much thinking in relationships. Another important element is what, how does this work? Is that, no, oh boy, I don't know what it, no. Doesn't do it, I think. Okay, never mind. There's the inversion of Occam's razor. For a very long time, what was dominant in our science was to think that if you have different solutions to a problem, some of them are more complex, some of them are simpler, you have to choose the simpler ones. That, in complex system science, is no longer the case. It's holistic, it's intellectual, it's multiscalar, it's open systems. An important part here also is that this is an approach in which you can actually, from the same perspective, think about moments in which a process goes on in a more or less regular way, but also start thinking about the moments when it doesn't work anymore. So what I'm aiming for is to learn from the past, about the present, and for the future. And two core elements in that are what I've called here ontological uncertainty, which basically means that no matter what you try, there is an unpredictability to what is happening, and the fact that we use models to try and at least help us think through some of those issues. Now, what does this do to urban systems? Because that is what we're all about here. On the one hand, I think it changes our perspective. A lot of work on urban systems has been about individual cities, has been about parts of a city. I think what is lacking, and which I'll try and develop in the next few slides, is a more general approach. And on the one hand, that means that we need to look at the totality of urbanity, urbanness, as one global system, and at the same time that we need to look at it in its non-urban context. Very often, the disciplines that have evolved study either urban environments or non-urban environments. That's a fundamental distinction we make, and I think one that is counterproductive. We need to focus from a network perspective, both on the edges and on the nodes. What we have done so far in a lot of complexity work, networked complexity work, is look at the edges. And we've explained things by saying, okay, this city or this place is connected by more edges than other ones, and that gives it a different role. But what we have insufficiently done so far in urban science is to look at how, through the connectivity, the roles and the functions of individual nodes start changing in that context. And an important part of that is that we have to look at the relative merits and demerits of distributed and hierarchical aspects of information processing. I'll get back to that in a moment. So we need to increase the dimensionality of our perspective. We need to have more place for social and ideational dimensions, and that is something that is emerging, and I think in part because in real life we're confronted with that, but complexity science actually facilitates thinking about that a bit better. We also need to move, and that is important from particularly sort of a biology perspective, a hard science perspective. For a long time, we have basically looked at the relationships between individuals and populations. What we need to start doing is looking at all the intermediate organizational forms that are between total populations and individuals. All those groups and other institutions that are a little bit like Russian dolls that create actually a lot of what is going on. And so finally, we need to compare the decisions that we make systematically with the options that we don't choose. And a very important part of that comparison is to begin to look at the unintended consequences of our actions and also try and figure out what might be the unintended consequences of those actions that we don't undertake. And that then gets us into risk assessment and issues like that. Now, one of the interesting things is, and that is where Peter Ho already mentioned Louise Bettencourt, with whom, through the Santa Fe Institute, we have been working, is the fact that there is no general theory of urban phenomena. There's lots of partial theories. There's lots of data. There's a huge movement right now towards gathering the data for urban analytics. But there has not been sufficient thinking and bringing together an explanation for the whole phenomenon of urbanization. From my first slide, why would people want to live in such a slummy kind of environment? There must be some sort of explanation, and that's what I'm going to try and look at in the next few slides. In that sense, I am not looking at proximate explanations, because everybody has done that, and there are as many as there are cities. I'm trying to find a more ultimate explanation for the phenomenon of urbanization altogether. And in order to do that, I have to base that on the most general of human parts, human actions, human functions. And I know two of those, actually, and I think they explain a lot. One of them is that we have to live by processing matter and energy. We need to eat. We need to have energy to do things. But the other thing is that we have to organize ourselves, and that is a unique aspect of human beings, by processing information. In the end, because energy and matter are subject to the laws of thermodynamics, information actually is not part of the conservation principle. It can therefore be shared, and that is what keeps societies together. So what I'm looking at is the whole phenomenon of societies, and I'll go back to a pre-urban state in my next slide, all the way to the present as actually growing flows of energy, matter, and information. And those flows are, in a sense, what makes order for each society, each person, each group, out of chaos. Now, the interesting thing about those networks and these flows of energy and information is that they're different. The ones that feed us, the energy matter flows, are dendritic. The information flows are much more complex than that. And so part of our explanations needs to be in how those two flows actually interact. That is why I was so pleased, belatedly, to find out the title of this particular symposium. Okay. This is part of the work that Bettencourt and West and others have been working at. And I know you can't read this. They're very small figures. But I want you to look at the three big, so the red, blue, and green blocks. The red one is the one about patents, about inventions, about research. And what is interesting is that it scales superlinearly with urban size. Energy scales sublinearly with urban size. And population, of course, scales, and everything derived from it, scales linearly with urban size. That has given me the idea that it's actually the information flows that are driving urban development and getting cities bigger and bigger. And so then you start thinking about, well, how do I have to imagine all of that? And the first one, I think, is at the individual level. And I think there is a feedback loop between what we see, what sense we make, that creates different perspectives and therefore different lights, different problems, and that then helps gain, again, more knowledge, more information processing capacity. If you project that onto the society as a whole, you actually begin to see that there comes a point where individuals can't do it anymore. They have to start working together to deal with these ever more complex problems that they have actually discovered. And that means that it begins to get more people together. That needs more food, more energy. So we need to organize for ways to get all of that together. So in the end, I think the way to formulate that is to see societies as flow structures that organize, which means They dissipate chaos, non-organized things, by the dynamic alignment of ideas, people, institutions, resources, and so on and so forth. Now, this is an image to sort of give you a sense of how this might work. If you take A, there's nothing. There's no city, there's nothing. B, what you begin to see is there's a small group of people that start processing information, that start, therefore, a growing dissipative flow. That grows in images C and D. Now, the important part of this image is that you realize that that only works, this perspective, if there is a continuate field of tension between the core and the periphery. And that is maintained by innovation. And we'll get to innovation a little while later. As soon as innovation can no longer happen, if it's blocked for one reason or other, you actually see that slowly but surely this whole group disintegrates. People start getting interested in their own things rather than in being part of the group. And so ultimately that disappears. I first worked at this from the perspective of the Roman Empire, but I think you can also do it from that of our present society. Now let's go back to the start of all of this. Around 10,000 years ago, we suddenly see the emergence of villages. And for a long time, we didn't know what that was. It might have been a way to have, at least you needed surplus. You needed to have the energy to organize the village. But I would argue that from the perspective of this developed, it is actually information processing that forces people to start living together. Because that reduces the communication time between people. And so a larger group starts being able to work more closely together. But that also means that they have to be sedentary, because if people keep moving around, then you can't really do this. So you actually start developing different subsistence techniques, like, for example, agriculture or herding or other ones like that. At the same time, we see in archaeology new topologies in our artifacts. An interesting topology is a hut, because until that moment, all that we had were topologies where an object was surrounded by a void. Now, for a first time, we actually have an object in which a void is surrounded by an object. Same thing for ceramics. That's why they're on there. So what you see is that there is really all kinds of things moving in our conceptualization. I've written about that. I'm not going to talk about that at this particular point. What I do want to point out, and you all know that, at least those of you who've lived in villages, that the information pool in a village is very homogeneous. Everybody knows everything about everybody else. And they all have the same way of doing things. Okay, that works for quite a considerable amount of time. Values are stable. They're confined to basic needs, basically food and things like that. Now, there are nevertheless a number of fundamental differences between villages and the stages before then. And I will go through those without getting into all of them. But basically, for the first time, we have a reciprocal relationship to nature. We don't simply pluck from nature what nature has prepared, but we start investing in nature by clearing fields, by sowing, by waiting, and so on and so forth. That changes, you get unintended consequences, you get shifts in the risk spectrum. In order to counter that, people start homogenizing parts of nature by creating agricultural fields, for example. Now, with all of that, okay, a number of environmental problems get solved, but social problems increase in importance, because the more people you bring together, the more misunderstanding, the more conflict. And that is, I think, where we see a fundamentally different way of information processing in which communication becomes more and more important. Okay? Let's get to the next one. What happens when that can no longer work, in the sense that that homogeneous information pool is no longer enough to start dealing with the challenges that have actually emerged while it was working? Population aggregates will grow. That means there's more conflict. One of the things that we see is that at that moment, people also start differentiating their activities. You get artisans, for example, and people who do different things, create different values for society. You begin to see that communication between different villages, because the villages are in different landscapes, so they have slightly different ways of doing things, becomes more and more important. And finally, what I would argue is that we see, and that's the way to summarize this, an expansion of the total set of values that actually keep the society together. That is what I've called here the value space. New ideas enable functional differentiation, crafts, exchange, trade, things like that, and an increasing emphasis on the network aspect of settlement. What you get is what we see in archaeology, monumental buildings, many cities always emerging at around the same time, no individual cities emerging separated from everything else. We see counting, one of the pre-writing tablets from Mesopotamia. We see writing. We see organized religion as a means to enforce things. We see administration emerging, clerks. And we see laws emerging. This is the first written law that we have in our environment, in our civilization. Okay, now the urban ways of life. I think what is really important that we need to realize, and I'll get back to that in the next slide, is that resource availability constrains the growth of cities. Information processing stimulates the growth of cities. Energy processing limits it. Innovation drives urbanization and vice versa. And of course, in that process, within the cities, you see hierarchization, which means information is power. But we also see that power to do something becomes slowly, as it is institutionalized, power over people. And we need to be wary of that in what we think about ourselves. Then, around 1800, we get the urban explosion. Why do we get an urban explosion? Because we have fossil energy. So it is no longer costly to innovate. It is no longer costly or as costly to bring lots of people together. What we get is an urban explosion. The cost of innovation goes down. We get an industrial revolution, and we get, and we're now getting into trouble about it, an acceleration of innovation, which threatens to overtake us, basically. So we remain in a path-dependent situation. That is, our culture still keeps going in more or less the same direction, but it goes faster and faster and faster. And in that sense, it has a little bit the effect of a Ponzi scheme. And yeah, I will get to that because the next slide, I think, should help me with that. There is then a path dependency that means that our kinds of innovations, our kinds of institutions stay pretty much the same. Now, let's look at what this does for the future, my last couple of slides. On the one hand, this is an argument to doubt a little bit in how far this business as usual scenario of cities ever growing will actually materialize. I would argue that the ICT revolution, the information processing revolution, actually undermines the need for spatial concentration. That climate may force us to reduce transport costs, and that food, water, energy problems actually fairly soon will constrain our business as usual scenario because it's much more costly to feed people in cities than outside them. So dispersed settlement, I think, is a possibility for the future because of the ICT, because it saves energy, and it improves resilience because communities are more united, and better united communities are more resilient. And so in the end, I would argue, and I do this generally by saying, okay, in the sustainability debate, everybody argues for innovation. But people forget that those 2.5 centuries of innovation are actually what has got us into trouble. So why would it get us out of trouble at this particular point? And so we need to rethink innovation and its suppression, which is also a very important element of any society's functioning together. one of the things under this sort of fairly cheap banner, but is that what we forget is that our economy is based on a limited value space. And that is one of the things that limits, and we see that more and more, its innovativeness. Ultimately, what we see is that within our value system, we have developed more and more complex ideas, structures, and institutions, but still within the same value space. And what I would argue is that the unintended consequences that I began my talk with actually ultimately make it impossible to go on like that, because the unintended consequences of our own earlier actions overwhelm us and thereby make it impossible to keep going. So our current resource-to-waste economy, which suppresses non-material, non-externalized values, needs to be reconsidered. It, in part, actually is what limits innovation and the economy. Can we innovate differently? We need to change that problem with the value space, and because I need to go a little bit faster, I'm basically going to summarize and say we can now decouple value creation and the accumulation of matter and energy because of the information revolution. That makes it possible to grow our economy in a more diverse way and with more non-material values. And we can also, rather than concentrate in certain places like cities, all our material resources, we can actually accord value to spreading them out. And that gives us a very different sense of economy. And then finally, a couple of remarks about how cities, I think, in 2030 or 40 or 50 should behave. And of course, I'm not going to predict what they will look like. But I would argue that the megacities will lose some of their predominance, that they will gain in autonomy, if only because on a local spatial scale, you have fewer unintended problems than you have on a very large scale. They cannot keep expanding. They must become more resilient. And in order to do that, what is very important, they have to start designing for change, not only responding to change. And I'll forgo the example that I have over there. I just want to have on my very last slide the fact that I think the most important thing is that urban attitudes have to change. Urban governance has to enable, not to constrain. Diversity has to be embraced. Decision-making, and that is absolutely fundamental because it goes against much of bureaucracy, much of scientific thinking, and many other things. We must learn to live much better with ambiguity, with the fact that things are not black and white, and that we even don't know what they are. Finally, decision-making is underdetermined by our own observations, so we have to do much more feedback, many more reflexive assessments and adjustments, experiments, and so on and so forth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Sender, for the thought-provoking keynote. In a minute, I'm going to invite him back on stage because I'm sure we have some questions for him. Now, as we set up the stage, and as Prof. Sender takes his seat for the Q&A, let's invite Mr. Peter Ho to join him on stage to moderate the Q&A session. Mr. Ho, please. As we only have 15 minutes for Q&A, may I ask that we keep our questions short and sharp so that our time is maximally used. Thank you.
Can you hear me from the back?
Yes.
All right. Now, we've had a brilliant presentation by Prof. Sander. He said all the things I've not been able to articulate about the challenges of governing and managing a city. And I'm sure many of you who are in this line of business will have questions or comments for Professor Sander. So can I just take the first question or comment? Yes, Professor Su then. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for a most interesting and constrained presentation. I just want to I just want to ask a question about the use of models that you mentioned. Typically, when people use models, you simplify. You take complex inputs and so on, and you model them, and then you say these are the possible outcomes. How do you see models being used differently?
I see models as things that you have to throw away regularly. Basically, I think models are things that can help you clarify your own thinking, but they cannot take over from that thinking. So you experiment with something, you create a model. The model can help you articulate the consequences of your thinking, but it will also help you see where you thought wrong. Then you throw it out and you start over again.
So the model takes the place of experiments.
Yes.
Yes, and I should also add that at yesterday's IRA symposium, there was some discussion on models, and I think there was a cautionary note made about not being too attached to modeling to guide the way we address problems. I've got 4 questions. Can I first take Marina, and then Peter, then April?
Mariana Matsugato. So thanks so much. Really interesting. I think one thing, though, that disturbs me is the potential sort of determinism behind what you're talking about, because I felt that specifically sort of the modes of production as they're changing over time, literally, you know, how value is created, processes of accumulation, how it changes even between feudalism and capitalism as it evolves over time, was kind of missing. So I'm just wondering, given that you did talk about accumulation at the end, where are, if you want, structures and modes of production in all of this?
They're all there. I've basically had 25 minutes, and what I've tried to do is emphasize the regularities, because most of urban theory does the opposite. And so I wanted to bring through the fact that there is a longer line of structural change that actually is important. And if I, in your case, may refer to our last meeting in Germany, I was feeling very strongly that that is an element that was completely missing in the debate with the economists. And that is why I've brought this one to the fore. Clearly, in the proximate explanations, all these things act together and create the real complexity that we now have to start deciphering.
Okay, great. Peter, April, then Parag, and I think I saw one more, and Aaron. Okay.
Hello. I may have missed something, but in your argument, as you moved later in your presentation, you seem to argue that the best outcome in the evolution of urban regions was ultimately dispersal, keeping instead of increasing concentration. Yet most studies on, for example, energy use in cities suggest that highly concentrated cities with few people on the land and most people in the city seems to be the most efficient. Manhattan being the most extreme example, where people tend to walk, not use automobiles, etc. So is there a contradiction, or did I miss it?
There is a very deliberate contradiction, but you make it more serious than it was intended. Basically, all I try to argue is that we have to be very careful to take this business as usual scenario and actually attach true value or truth value to it. I would argue that there are contrary arguments that will also, in some cases, work towards dispersal. And one of the issues, of course, behind all of this is, well, what is going to happen to our energy? Are we going to be able to continue to have the energy that we have, or don't we? We just don't know. I think that is the main argument that I wanted to make, rather than say it's going this way or it's going that way.
That's enough, Peter? Okay, great. April, Parag, and Aaron.
Thank you very much. I work in this space. You actually had a bullet about it. Thank you very much, on the sharing economy.
Yeah.
And looking at what that means for cities. And I work a lot with policymakers. And one of the things, I love what you're saying here, and I think it applies on many levels to what's happening in the sharing economy, let's say. But my question is, it's a bit tactical, where you're working with policymakers, let's say, and they're saying, yes, we want to embrace this, and we want to embrace complexity theory, and we get what you're saying. But in all due respect, we have to make sure that we're still protecting public benefits. We have to still make sure that we're providing some minimal level of well-being. So they're trying to set policy, or as they would say, building the plane and flying it at the same time. I'm just curious to know whether you have any exposure or experience in those situations where policymakers with one hand are trying to embrace the kinds of things you're talking about, and on the other they're saying, but too much disruption or too much change, whether it be a new business model or a new way of working or a new way of connecting in our communities, might actually be disruptive, and so we can't go as far as we'd like to.
Oh, I think that is all over the place, that kind of problem. There's no doubt about that. And we actually talked quite extensively in the last couple of days in the IRA symposium about that particular issue. And I entirely agree. I think what is necessary here is that we realize that these are major battles, that we need to use those occasions where we actually think change may happen. And to be honest, I'm saying this here in Singapore because of a particular experience. At one point, I was asked by the European Union to look at why environmental policy was not working at different levels. And one of the interesting parts of that research is that it actually works very well in a regional level, where the people who are deciding are also part of the same social system as the ones that are executing. Once you get to national level, which I did at that point look at in France, for example, that becomes much, much more difficult because of the distance between the actual population and the goods and the politicians. At the European level, I had a very amazing experience. I was together with the Swedish Under Minister for Education, and we were physically kicked out of the office because they didn't want to know. So it gives you a sense. Now, I do believe that there are entrepreneurs in particular who are doing this in a very interesting way. In a place called Haarlemmermeer, don't pronounce it, in my own country, in Holland, there is an entrepreneur who is now making buildings according to a completely different scheme. He actually leaves the ownership of the building materials with the people who provide them, and he just rents it for 20 years, for example. If the building needs to change function and part needs to be dismantled, the stuff goes back to the owner, mainly iron and stuff like that. So what is happening here is a deliberate design for change. And I think that is what I think is the important part of what we're talking about.
Parab.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Professor, for the presentation. This is a sort of direct follow-on to Peter's question, actually. You hinted towards the end of the presentation that dispersal, as you described it, could be driven by the ICT revolution and connectivity, and that would enable people, of course, to move away, potentially, from cities. And I think there was a bit of a normative tone in what you were saying. I've tried recently to look for every society where there is some amount of de-urbanization going on, where people are choosing, whether it's Chinese escaping pollution and going into the interior, or Japanese people deciding to move to the countryside, Israelis going to kibbutzes, people flocking away from high real estate prices in London, unemployed American college graduates working in agriculture, you name it. Even April potentially moving from a big city to a smaller city to leverage the sharing economy. It's, of course, add it all up worldwide, it's numerically, completely, utterly insignificant compared to the scale of urbanization. It seems far more likely that rising sea levels and coastal surges would force us to move inland rather than just the ICT connectivity alone, because people move to cities for so many different reasons. So could you perhaps elaborate one or two other things that you think could potentially drive this dispersal?
I think there are many drivers, and I think sea level rise is a very important one, there's no question. I did not say that ICT would drive people to do that. I simply said that it enabled people to do that. And I think that is the fundamental difference here. I'm not arguing for ICT pushing everybody out. I'm simply saying the actual need to be together in a confined space might actually become less stringent than it is at present. And let's not forget that we're here talking about a period, and you have 2030 as the goal. I think we need to think actually further ahead in time, that we really don't have a clue what this ICT revolution is going to be doing. I mean, look at it from an archaeologist's perspective. We've had two revolutions like this. The first is, how do we master matter? And the second is, how did we master energy? Those were processes that took thousands of years. Okay, in our case, it'll go much faster, no doubt. But I think it'll take several hundred years. And I think that is what we have to look at.
Good. Aaron?
Yeah, thank you very much.
And one more question. All right.
Your point on dimensionality reminded me of Elinor Ostrom's work about polycentricity of governance. And it strikes me that it's important to think of some things which are best dealt with at the global level, some at the national, some at the regional, some at the very local level. Do you have thoughts on general principles about what types of issues are best dealt with at the global, at the urban, and at the suburban levels?
I think that, again, is regionally dependent on what the main issues are. What I do believe, though, and I think, say that, is that because urban systems are a subpart of, let's say, nation states or continental states, they will be confronted with fewer unintended consequences that they can't deal with than if you keep doing everything at the nation state level. And I think that is what is the important part of the argument. Again, I can try and look towards the future, but I cannot in any way say in which particular case, which particular thing will be easier to solve. I think there is really interesting, and you mentioned that this morning, the sort of work on which cities can be successful or cannot be. We did work in France in the 90s, about 5,500 municipalities in France, and we could begin to predict which ones would succeed, which ones would absolutely not succeed, and which ones were up the cusp, and you could actually help with the European subsidy. And the same factors came out. The diversity of the population, the age factors of the population, the immediate resources in the environment, including industries and things like that, and transport, access to transport. And so those things all vary in different proportions in different places. So I can't say in a general sense, this is very much part of what complex systems is all about, that I cannot linearize and generalize, but that I have to maintain, and I can only sort of point to the options.
I'm sorry, I'm only taking one more question from Min Lak because we're reaching the end of this session. But please corner Professor Sander during the tea break. Min Lak, you've got the last word.
Well, Prof. Sander, firstly, I thought that was a brilliant presentation. Thanks very much. My question is about the drivers of aggregation and accumulation. And you had postulated that the underlying driver is really information processing. And applying one of your earlier slides about post-ante and ex-post lens, I wonder whether that in some ways is driven by the fact that we are sited in information revolution. Are there other possible drivers of accumulation throughout time that you considered, which could have been possible? And I ask that because that perspective of what are the key drivers of accumulation drives our perspective of how things will evolve. And the secondary question is, do the drivers change over time? For example, were the drivers of accumulation different at the point of the agricultural revolution as opposed to the industrial revolution and the information revolution?
Okay. First of all, there have been tens, if not hundreds, of other theories about why people first start settling in villages. They are all over archaeology, whether it's water management, the fact that they live in oases, the fact that they manage, because of agriculture, to have some surplus, and so on and so forth. What I've deliberately tried to do is move away from the level of those proximate explanations and move towards the most abstract one, because that is the one that I think is ultimately the most likely to provide us with a general idea of what created urban systems. Now, information processing is such a hugely general term that you can catch just about anything in technology, in social relations, in functionality, and so on and so forth under that. So that is one side of your question. The other side of the question is, okay, yes, we are located in the information revolution, and that clearly has opened our eyes to the fact that information is really important. That may be, therefore, a bias. But I want to repeat that of the three basic commodities that we recognize, energy, matter, and information, there are only, for the moment, three that we know. And I would argue that matter was conquered about 50,000 to 25,000 before present, that energy actually stayed much the same until the 1800s, and that information is now the third of those major revolutions that actually affect us as a human race all over the place. And that is why I'm emphasizing it.
Well, thank you very much. I think you all agree with me that we had a wonderful start to both the complexity workshop as well as to the Foresight conference, and for that we owe a lot to Professor Sander for his very insightful presentation as well as his response to your very provocative questions. So thank you very much.
Again, thank you for bringing me here. This is wonderful.
Thank you, Professor Sander and Mr. Ho. We will now adjourn for a short tea break. After the break, Foresight Conference participants, please be seated at the More room on your right. I repeat, the More room on your right by 10:10 a.m. Complexity Workshop participants, please proceed to the Harlot room on your left by 10:10 a.m. Enjoy your conversations over tea break. See you later.